Tonight there will be some fun. I invited my poor, pathetic ex-wife. Damien raised his glass, boasting to wealthy friends at his lavish engagement party. Guests laughed, waiting for Isabella to walk in, humiliated. But when the grand doors opened, the whole hall fell silent. Isabella stepped out of a limousine beside billionaire Victor Laurent and 3 children triplets. Damien collapsed. His plan to shame her had turned into his own public disgrace. Isabella stood there, her face calm, her plain gray dress catching the chandelier light. She wasn't wearing makeup, and her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail. The triplets clung to her hands, their little faces curious but steady, mirroring their mother's quiet strength. Victor, tall and sharp in a tailored suit, stood just behind her, his presence like a wall. The room buzzed with whispers, but Isabella didn't flinch. She just looked straight ahead, her eyes locking on Damien for a split second before moving past him, like he was a stranger she'd already forgotten. The air felt heavy, like everyone knew something big was about to happen, but nobody could guess what. Damien's smirk faded as he gripped his champagne flute, his knuckles turning white. Claudia, his fiancée, stood frozen in her sparkling gown, her lips parting but no words coming out. The triplets' tiny shoes clicked on the marble floor, and Isabella's hand tightened around theirs, guiding them forward. She didn't rush. She didn't hesitate. She moved like she belonged. Hey, before we go further, grab your phone real quick. If this story's hitting, you give it a like, drop a comment below, and hit that subscribe button. It means a lot to share these moments with you, stories of heartbreak, betrayal, and coming out stronger. All right, let's keep going. The ballroom was a sea of wealth, gold-trimmed tables, crystal glasses, and designer dresses that cost more than most people's cars. Damien had planned every detail to scream success, to show the world he'd made it. He stood at the center, his slicked-back hair and custom tuxedo, screaming money. His friends, a pack of hedge fund bros and socialites, circled him, laughing too loud, their eyes darting toward the doors. They'd all heard the story. Damien's ex-wife, the nobody he'd left behind, was coming to his engagement party. She'll probably show up in some thrift store rag, Claudia had said earlier, tossing her blonde curls, her diamond earrings glinting. The crowd had eaten it up, ready for a show. They wanted to see Isabella crawl, in humiliated, proving Damien's point. He'd traded up, and she was nothing. As Isabella walked past a towering floral arrangement, a man in a pinstripe suit, his cufflinks flashing like tiny spotlights, leaned toward his date and muttered, "Look at her," trying to play the part with that dollar store dress. His voice carried deliberate and cruel, and his date giggled, her sequined clutch catching the light. The triplets turned their heads, their small brows furrowing, but Isabella didn't pause. She adjusted the strap of her simple canvas bag, her fingers steady, and kept walking. A server passing by caught her eye, offering a small nod, like he recognized something in her that the others didn't. Isabella returned the nod, her lips barely curving, but it was enough to make the man in the pinstripe suit shift uncomfortably in his seat, his smirk fading as he noticed the server's quiet respect. Isabella kept walking, her steps steady, the triplets pressed close to her legs. She didn't blink, didn't blush. She just looked at Claudia, her eyes steady, like she was seeing right through her. Borrowed? Isabella said, her voice soft but sharp. No, I chose this. The words landed like a slap, quiet but final. Claudia's smile froze, and for a second the room went quiet, like everyone felt the shift but didn't know why. Isabella didn't wait for a response. She turned, guiding the triplets toward a table near the back, her movement smooth like she was walking through a storm she'd seen 100 times before. Victor followed, his hand hovering near her shoulder, not touching, but close enough to say he had her back. The crowd wasn't done, though. A guy in a velvet blazer, his hair gelled to perfection, leaned back in his chair as Isabella passed. He was the kind of guy who lived for attention, always chasing the next deal, the next Instagram post. "Hey, sweetheart," he called, loud enough for the whole room to hear. "You know, this isn't a soup kitchen, right?" His table erupted and he grinned, soaking it up. Another woman, her pearls gleaming, added, "Those kids are cute, but they don't belong here. This is a grown-up party." She said it with a smile, like she was being kind, but her eyes were cold. The triplets looked up at Isabella, their faces tight, one of them tugging at her sleeve. Isabella knelt down, whispering something to them, her hand cupping the back of their heads. They nodded, their eyes wide, but trusting. She stood back up, her face calm, and said to the woman, "They belong with me." The woman's smile faded, and she looked away, suddenly interested in her wine glass. A woman in a sapphire gown, her fingers dripping with rings, stood up from a nearby table, her voice loud and syrupy with fake concern. "Oh, honey, you must feel so out of place here," she said, tilting her head like she was talking to a lost child. "Why don't you just slip out quietly? Save yourself the embarrassment." The crowd tittered, some nodding their eyes gleaming with anticipation. Isabella paused, her hand resting on one of the triplets' chairs, and turned to face the woman. Her gaze was steady, unyielding, and she said, "I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The woman's rings clinked against her glass as her hand shook, and she sat down, her face flushed as the room's laughter died into an awkward murmur. Damien watched it all, his jaw tight, his champagne flute shaking slightly. He'd planned this night to bury Isabella, to make her the punchline of his perfect life. But she wasn't breaking. She wasn't running. She was just there, standing in his spotlight, refusing to shrink. Claudia grabbed his arm, her nails digging in. "Do something," she hissed. Damien stepped forward, and his voice loud, trying to take control. "Isabella, come on, you don't belong here," he said, his tone mocking but shaky. "You're embarrassing yourself. Just go." The crowd nodded, some murmuring agreement, others just watching, waiting for her to crack. Isabella turned to him, her eyes locking on his, and said, "I was invited." 2 words steady and cold, like she was stating a fact nobody could argue with. Damien's mouth opened, but nothing came out. The room felt smaller, the air thicker, like something was about to break. At a corner table, a young woman in a sleek black dress, her influencer vibe screaming curated perfection, pulled out her phone and started filming Isabella. "This is gold," she whispered to her friend, her voice gleeful. "Poor girl thinks she's somebody. Wait till this hits my story." Her friend laughed, but the video kept rolling, capturing Isabella adjusting a triplet's bow tie with care. The influencer's smile faltered when Isabella glanced her way. Not angry, just steady, like she saw the phone and didn't care. The influencer lowered her device, her fingers hesitating, and muttered, "Whatever, it's not worth it." But the clip was already uploaded, and within minutes comments started pouring in, not mocking Isabella, but calling out the influencer's cruelty, her own followers turning on her. Years ago, Isabella sat in a cramped apartment, the kind with peeling paint and a sink that always dripped. She was 19, pregnant, and alone, folding tiny baby clothes on a wobbly table. Damien had just left her his suitcase by the door, his voice sharp as he said, "You're holding me back." She didn't cry then either. She just folded another onesie, her hands steady, her face blank. The memory flickered as she stood in the ballroom, her fingers brushing the edge of her bag, where a tiny faded baby sock was tucked inside, a reminder of what she'd carried through. She didn't look at it now, but her thumb grazed the zipper, and for a moment her lips tightened like she was swallowing something heavy. The hall manager rushed in. His face flushed, his tie slightly crooked. "Mr. Cole," he said, his voice low but urgent. A fleet of limousines just pulled up outside. Damien laughed, trying to brush it off. What her sugar daddy brought his car collection. The crowd chuckled, but it was nervous now, like they sensed something was off. Claudia smirked, tossing her hair again. "Probably rented them to look important," she said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "She's always been desperate for attention." The guests nodded, clinging to the narrative they'd been fed. Isabella, the pathetic ex, trying to claw her way into their world. But the manager didn't laugh. He looked at Isabella, then back at Damien, and said, "They're registered to Ms. Hart." The room went quiet, the kind of quiet where you could hear a pin drop. Claudia's glass slipped just a little in her hand. A man with a goatee, his suit slightly too tight, leaned over to his buddy, his voice carrying across the room. "Bet she's just a front for some shady deal," he said, smirking. "No way someone like her owns anything real." His buddy nodded, but their laughter stopped when the hall manager handed Isabella a tablet, his hands trembling slightly. She tapped the screen, her face calm, and handed it back with a quiet, "Thank you." The manager nodded, almost bowing, and hurried away. The goateed man's smirk faded as he caught a glimpse of the screen, a property deed with Isabella's name in bold. He sank back in his chair, his face red, muttering something about lucky breaks to no one in particular. Isabella didn't react. She just guided the triplets to their table, helping them into their chairs, her movements slow and deliberate. Victor stood nearby, his eyes scanning the room like he was waiting for something. The crowd started whispering again, but it wasn't cruel now, it was confused. "Ms. Hart." A woman muttered, her diamond bracelet glinting as she leaned toward her friend. "Who even is she?" Another guy, his tie loosened, checked his phone, his brow furrowing as he scrolled. Isabella adjusted a napkin in front of one of the triplets, her face calm, but her fingers lingered on the cloth, folding it just a little too carefully like she was steadying herself for what was coming. Damien tried to laugh it off, raising his glass again. "See," too cowardly to show her face, he said, his voice louder than it needed to be. "I win." She didn't even dare to come. But the words felt hollow, and his friends didn't laugh as hard this time. Claudia jumped in, her voice sharp. "She's probably washing dishes somewhere," she said, her eyes darting to the doors like she was trying to convince herself. The crowd clapped, but it was scattered, unsure. Then the manager's words cut through again. "The limousines, sir. They're hers." Damien's smile froze, and he turned, his eyes narrowing as he looked at Isabella. She didn't look back. She was wiping a smudge off one of the triplets' faces, her touch gentle, her focus entirely on them. A woman with a high-pitched laugh, her dress a garish shade of pink, stood up holding her wineglass like a weapon. "Oh, please, limousines don't mean anything," she said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. "Anyone can rent a car and a guy in a suit. She's just pretending to be someone." The crowd tittered, some nodding, but their confidence was slipping. Isabella didn't look up. She was helping one of the triplets cut a piece of bread, her hand steady, but her jaw tightened for a split second. Victor leaned forward, his voice low but clear. "Pretending," he said, his eyes locking on the woman. "Her name's on the title of every car out there. Care to check?" The woman's laugh died, and she sat down, her glass shaking as she set it on the table. The doors opened again, and the room turned to look. Isabella stood smoothing her dress and walked toward the entrance, Victor and the triplets following. The crowd parted, their whispers growing louder, more urgent. "No way. That's the poor ex-wife." A man muttered, his cufflinks gleaming as he craned his neck. Claudia's face went pale, but she recovered fast, stepping forward with a sneer. "Oh, so she found herself a sugar daddy," she said, her voice loud, meant to carry. "Money makes anyone look good. She's nothing but a gold digger." Damien nodded, jumping on the lifeline. "Exactly," he said, his voice steadier now. "She's just riding his coattails. Always was desperate." The crowd laughed again, but it was thinner, like they weren't sure who to believe anymore. Victor stopped, turning to face Claudia. His smile was small, sharp, like he'd been waiting for this. "You're wrong," he said, his voice calm but cutting. "Isabella is the one who invested in my company, not the other way around." He held up a folder, the kind with embossed leather, and flipped it open. "She owns 30% of Laurent Global." The room went silent, the kind of silence that sucks the air out of everything. Claudia's mouth dropped open, her lipstick smudged from biting her lip. Damien's face dripped with sweat, his eyes darting between Victor and Isabella. "Impossible," he stammered. "She used to be dirt poor." Isabella looked at him, her face still, and said, "Poor yesterday doesn't mean poor forever." The words were quiet, but they hit like a hammer, and the crowd shifted, their whispers turning to murmurs of shock. A man in a bow tie, his face flushed from too much wine, stood up, his chair scraping loudly. "Invested. Her..." He scoffed, his voice slurring slightly. "What, did she win the lottery or something?" His table laughed, but it was forced uneasy. Isabella didn't flinch. She reached into her bag, pulling out a small worn notebook, its pages dog-eared. She opened it, flipping to a page, and handed it to Victor. He glanced at it, then held it up, showing a list of dates and figures, her handwriting meticulous. "This is her investment log," Victor said, his voice steady. "Every deal, every dollar tracked for years." The man in the bow tie sat down hard, his face red, and the room's murmurs grew louder, some guests leaning forward trying to catch a glimpse of the notebook. Years ago, Isabella sat in a small office, her hands folded on a cheap desk, listening to a man in a suit talk about investments. She'd saved every penny from her waitressing job, her fingers calloused from carrying trays. The man had laughed, saying, "You're too young to understand this." She didn't argue. She just handed him a check, her handwriting, neat, her face blank. That check was the first step, the seed that grew into something nobody saw coming. Now in the ballroom, her fingers brushed the edge of her bag again, where a small folded receipt from that day was tucked away, a quiet reminder of how far she'd come. The crowd was buzzing, now, phones out, cameras flashing. Damien tried to regain control, his voice cracking. "And those 3 kids? They're not mine." He snapped, pointing at the triplets who were sitting quietly, their eyes wide. Claudia jumped in, her voice shrill. "Yes, they must be that billionaire's children." The crowd nodded, some muttering, "Women are never honest." The triplets' faces crumpled and they burst into tears, their small voices calling, "Daddy, why would you say that?" Isabella knelt beside them, her hands steadying their shoulders, whispering something soft. She stood her eyes on Damien and the room waited, holding its breath. Victor stepped forward, pulling a paper from his folder. "These children are Damien Cole's biological kids," he said, holding up DNA test results. The crowd gasped, heads turning to Damien, who stood frozen, his face purple. A woman with a fur stole, her lips pursed in judgment, leaned toward her husband and said, "DNA tests can be faked. She's probably just desperate to trap him." Her voice was loud enough to carry, and the triplets' sobs grew louder. Isabella's hand froze on one of their shoulders, her fingers tightening for a moment. She turned to the woman, her voice low but piercing. "Desperate," she said. "I raised them alone while he walked away." The woman's stole slipped off her shoulder, and she didn't bother to fix it, her face pale as the room's attention shifted to her, then back to Isabella, who was already turning back to her children, wiping their tears with a napkin. The triplets ran to Damien, their little arms reaching out, crying, "Daddy." He stumbled back, his hands up, like he could push them away. Claudia's glass hit the floor, shattering, her hands trembling. Isabella looked at Damien, her voice cold but steady. "You didn't just abandon me," she said. "You abandoned your own blood." The words hung in the air, and the room turned on Damien, their eyes full of contempt. He looked around searching for an ally, but even his friends looked away, their faces tight. Claudia screamed, "It's fake!" She paid for those results. Her voice was desperate now, cracking at the edges. Damien clung to her words, nodding. "Yes, she staged all this to humiliate me," he said, his voice shaking. The crowd murmured, some, still unsure, their phones still raised, recording everything. A man in a corner, his suit wrinkled from slouching, stood up, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "Oh, come on, she's playing you all," he said, gesturing at Isabella. "This is just a stunt to make us feel sorry for her." The crowd hesitated, some nodding, but their confidence was fraying. Isabella didn't look at him. She was helping one of the triplets tie a shoelace, her movements careful, deliberate. A server approached carrying a tray of drinks and whispered something to Isabella. She nodded, her face unchanged, and the server walked away, but not before shooting the man a look of pure disdain. The man sat down, his sarcasm deflated as the server's loyalty to Isabella rippled through the room, making people question their assumptions. Isabella smiled, just a small curve of her lips, and lifted her phone. "I prepared for this day," she said, her voice calm, like she was stating the weather. She tapped the screen, and the ballroom's massive projector lit up. A video played Isabella standing at a podium delivering a keynote at an international finance conference. She was in a plain suit, no jewelry, but the room was packed with suits and ties, billionaires hanging on her every word. Then headlines flashed, Isabella Hart, the mastermind behind New York's largest charity foundation. The crowd gasped, cameras flashing faster now. Claudia collapsed into a chair, her hands covering her face. Damien's face turned ashen, his knees buckling as he gripped the edge of a table. A young man in a flashy watch, his ego bigger than his bank account, stood up trying to salvage the crowd's loyalty. "So, what?" "She's got some headlines," he said, his voice loud but shaky. "Doesn't mean she's not a fraud." His words were meant to rally the room, but they fell flat. Isabella didn't respond. She was adjusting a hairpin in one of the triplets' hair, her touch gentle, her focus unwavering. Victor handed her a small card from his pocket, and she glanced at it, then tucked it into her bag. The card's logo caught the light, Laurent Global's crest. The young man's watch glinted as he sat down, his bravado gone, as whispers spread about the card's significance. Years ago, Isabella stood in a soup kitchen ladling food onto plates, her hands steady, despite the exhaustion in her eyes. A woman had thanked her, squeezing her hand, saying, "You're an angel." Isabella had smiled, saying nothing, but that moment had planted another seed. She'd started small, donating what little she had, then building step by step until her foundation fed thousands. Now in the ballroom, her hand rested on one of the triplets' shoulders, her touch light but firm, like she was anchoring them to her strength. Damien wasn't done. He pushed forward, his voice loud, desperate. "You think money makes you better than me?" He screamed. "You'll always be my ex-wife, a stain on my life." The crowd whispered, some shaking their heads, muttering, "He still won't admit defeat." Claudia sobbed, her mascara streaking, and ran out, her heels echoing in the silence. Damien looked around, his eyes wild, searching for support. But the room was cold, every eye on him full of judgment. Isabella didn't respond. She just held the triplets' hands, her face calm, her silence louder than his screams. A woman in a velvet gown, her eyes sharp with envy, stood up, her voice cutting through the tension. "This is all a show," she said, her hands on her hips. "She's just manipulating everyone with her little act." The crowd murmured, some nodding, but their energy was fading. Isabella didn't look up. She was showing one of the triplets a small flower from the table's centerpiece, her voice soft as she explained its name. The woman's accusation hung in the air unanswered until a guest at her table, an older man with a quiet presence, stood and said, "I've seen her work. Her foundation saved my sister's life." The woman in the velvet gown froze, her hands dropping, and sat down, her face burning, as the room's attention shifted to the older man's quiet conviction. Victor stepped forward, raising his glass. "A toast to Isabella Hart, billionaire, and a great mother," he said, his voice steady, commanding. The hall erupted in applause, the sound rolling over Damien like a wave. He collapsed, sinking into a chair, his hands covering his face. Isabella turned, guiding the triplets toward the doors, her steps slow, deliberate. The crowd parted again, their phones still out, capturing every moment. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The truth was everywhere, on the screen, in the whispers, in the way the room shifted when she moved. The next morning, the fallout began. Claudia's social media was flooded with screenshots of her cruel comments, her sponsorship deals vanishing by noon. She posted a tearful apology video, but it was too late. Her followers dropped her like a hot coal. Damien's company fired him that afternoon, their press release citing conduct unbecoming. His friends, the same ones who'd laughed with him, stopped taking his calls. One of them, the guy in the velvet blazer, was caught in a viral clip, groveling to Isabella outside the venue, his voice shaky as he begged for a meeting. She had just kept walking, her hand on one of the triplets' backs, her face calm. A few days later, the woman in the sapphire gown was dropped from her charity board after donors cited her behavior at the party as unacceptable. Her name vanished from event lists, her calls unanswered. The influencer in the black dress lost half her followers overnight, her agency dropping her after the backlash. The man with the goatee faced an audit, his shady deals exposed in a news article that mentioned Isabella's name as a whistleblower. Each consequence landed quietly, like stones settling in a pond, the ripples spreading without fanfare. Isabella's limousine pulled away, the triplets laughing in the back seat, their voices bright as they talked about the lights outside. She leaned back, her hands folded in her lap, her plain dress still catching the glow of the city. She didn't smile, but her eyes were steady, like she had finally set something down. The driver glanced back, his voice soft. "Home, Ms. Hart." She nodded, her fingers brushing the faded baby sock in her bag one last time. The car moved through the city, leaving the ballroom behind, its lights fading in the distance. Years ago, someone had told her she'd never be enough. She'd stood in a doorway, her hands empty, her heart heavy, and promised herself she'd prove them wrong. Not for them, for her. For the kids she'd carry, for the life she'd build. Now she had done it. Not with noise, not with anger, but with every quiet step she took. You've been there, haven't you? Judged, looked down on, told you didn't belong, but you kept going. You carried your truth even when it hurt. You weren't wrong. You weren't alone. And you're still here. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.